Bonjour.
Good afternoon. Welcome for this session about multilateralism tested against new risks. There is no journalist in this session. I will introduce the different guests and I will deliver an introduction. I'm delighted to introduce Jacques ASCHENBROICH, who is next to me, the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Valeo. Michael FROMAN, Vice Chairman and President of the Strategic Growth Mastercard. Arvind SUBRAMANIAN, former Chief Economic Advisor of the Government of India. FURMAN, Harvard Kennedy School. Yaroslav LISSOVOLIK, working for Sberbank. And Mahendra, SIREGAR, Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs in Indonesia. For this session, we will have a look at efficiency of multilateralism and what does COVID tell us about the shortcomings and the future of this concept. 3 points that I would like to address. Reactions of the international organizations to crises regarding health. First, cooperation was quite low and even competitive. This is something that we have to admit. We couldn't compare data across many months. And the different countries embarked upon a race to get the medical equipment. Lots of tariff barriers were erected. There is a lot of competition among countries so that they can get a vaccine. But we know that it would be pivotal to coordinate in order to eradicate the virus, because the virus is pervasive around the world. Regarding economic cooperation, I can tell you that there was a moratorium on the debt service for the emerging crisis. So we didn't want to have an economic crisis with a health crisis, and the central banks stepped in with a program of liquidities and cash. If you have a look at the budget measures that were implemented, the IMF has pulled out all the stops to help. So what does it mean in terms of the future of international cooperation? In terms of health, do we have an institution that works? Is it efficient? Can it be improved? We've seen that cooperation was positive in the field of economics. Of course, economic globalization made it possible for 1/3 of the humanity to be lifted from poverty. In the future, should we only focus on the economy? Should we focus on our common goods, climate, health, migrations? Maybe we should address other topics, immediate consequences, and some countries with a monopolistic status could harm international cooperation. Regarding digital technologies and taxation, we should review the competition rules. And there's another topic that is strategic, and then I will stop, and then I will give the floor to the colleagues. So geopolitics, So the world that built the Bretton Woods agreements, the world is totally different now to that of Bretton Woods. You have lots of powers, the US, China, and emerging countries. You have India also. So the world is now different. So it does change the way we work and the way institutions work. And then you have to consider the global production channels. And I think that we need to elaborate on that with Jacques ASCHENBROICH. We've heard about economic sovereignty to repatriate the supply chains. Is it the best solution? Even though you have to handle health issues, what does it mean for emerging countries? And emerging countries can catch up because they are part and parcel of the value chains, the supply chains. So 3 topics, governance and efficiency of international organizations. What should we focus on? Economic cooperation or any other kind of cooperation? And third, how do we make sure that everybody takes part in growth so that growth benefits the highest number of people? So Arvind, SUBRAMANIAN, what is your take on that? What do you think of the international cooperation, and what do you think of emerging countries and the role of India?
Well, thanks very much to the organizers for having me. It's a great pleasure to be to join you from so far away. The topic for the session, multilateralism and its future, is a very, very timely thing to be discussing. Let me make 3 propositions just to start the debate. We know that the international multilateral system as we have today was put in place after World War II with the kind of benevolent hegemony of the United States, and this function for all its system for all its problems worked reasonably well. But I think it's fair to say, and this is my first proposition, is that we are no longer in a unipolar world. For a while, we thought there were going to be 2 great powers working, cooperatively, cooperatively with each other. But actually, the way I see the world now is that we're in a G-2 world, where the 2 big superpowers, the United States and China, far from supplying global public goods, are actually supplying global public bads. Whether it's undermining institutions, whether it's theft of intellectual property, whether it's closing markets, across the board, what we find is that we don't just not have leadership from the 2 big powers. We actually have leadership that is detrimental and undermining the international system and its institutions in many ways. So we have a G-2 world, not a G1 or a G0 world that people talk about. So that's proposition 1. Proposition 2 means that in that case, it is therefore no secret that cooperation has basically completely collapsed. You can see this in the aftermath of the COVID crisis. The response of the G20 and the IMF, several people have said, has been far from adequate. The WTO as an institution has been now dead for some time now, and of course around the WHO there are all these questions about what happened when, who did what when, what was China's role, etc. So I think that multilateral cooperation is in very bad shape, and we see manifestations of that everywhere. So that's proposition number 2. The proposition number 3, I think, is looking forward. How should we be thinking about multilateral cooperation in this G-2 world, as it were? And one kind of very, sharp way of posing this would be to say the following. In the case of China, Dengism has clearly not survived Deng. I think under Deng Xiaoping, there were, 3 propositions. Internally, kind of leadership would be more collective. Second, there would be an emphasis on market-based reform. And three, that China would not assert itself too aggressive internationally. But under Xi Jinping, all those three propositions have been violated. It's become much more centralized, repressive internally. As my colleague Nick Clardy has shown, economically, China has turned away from markets and has gone backwards in terms of reform, which is going to undermine its own model. And three, now we see around the world, China has become much more aggressive internationally, whether it's Hong Kong, Taiwan, South China Sea, now India, Xinjiang. So it's so that's, we have to see that, is cooperation possible with one of the superpowers which is now turned this way? But on the other side, and this is the last proposition that I have, is that the future for multilateral cooperation, we know what's happening on the Chinese side, very difficult. On the US side, I think the big question is, will Trumpism survive Trump? We know that, if Trump comes back to power, I think completely the whole, all bets are off in terms of, cooperation. But if we get a change of leadership in the US, is it still the case that, we can go back, not completely, but to some extent, to old forms of cooperation? What I mean, and the reason why one shouldn't take that for granted at all is because, one, the anti-China sentiment is kind of bipartisan in the United States. The view that this is a power that is challenging us, and therefore how we should deal with China, I think is an open question. And of course, the other thing which is, there's more ideological convergence in the US is kind of, or rather to put it, the old consensus in favor of globalization has frayed to a considerable extent. So whether it's anti-China, whether it's globalization, whether it's, how should a status quo superpower accommodate a rising power? On these questions, it's not at all clear that Trump is unusual or exceptional. So the future of multilateral cooperation is going to depend upon, whether Trumpism survives Trump, and the fact that Dengism hasn't survived Deng. How does the world cope with that? Those are the three propositions. Last thing I would say, I think emerging powers like India at this stage, they have so many problems internally. I think what is possible perhaps is some coalition of the middle powers, as it were, Canada, Australia, Singapore, Europe to some extent. Maybe that's possible, but I don't think, the old emerging powers like Brazil or India are going to play. They're not internally cohesive enough, nor economically strong enough to make any kind of, they can help, they can cooperate, but they're not going to shape the system. The future of the system is very much going to depend upon this G-2 world and how it pans out.
Mr. Subramanian was saying the future of multilateralism doesn't have to do so much with what emerging markets can do, like India or perhaps Indonesia, and we'll see that in a minute. But it depends a lot more on how China and the US manage to talk to each other. So before moving to Mr. SIREGAR, perhaps I will ask Michael FROMAN to actually react to this and what he sees about it. Or let's ask Mr. SIREGAR then to
Thank you very much.
See if the view complements.
I cannot hear you, but since my picture is on the screen, I guess you are asking me on the same question, but I did not hear your question in the beginning. If I can also share our view on the same matter, I think I would like to start by saying that like almost all aspects of our lives, the world multilateral system is also being disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic and its unprecedented impacts. While that said, I think we should not have too high expectation on the multilateralism in the first place to solve the global crisis by themselves. I think that is an unrealistic expectation in the beginning. To substantiate this argument, let me mention three facts that happened at the same time in the COVID crisis period recently. First, of course, if you look at the UN organization or bodies, we have seen that many of these UN organizations have provided general platforms for international collaboration against the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact. Among others, we see the commitment not to restrict flow of goods that are for countries to address the impact of the pandemic and promote collaboration in finding the vaccines and medicines. The World Bank and the IMF have contributed in mobilizing international financial resources to support national governments in addressing the fiscal challenges, as well as improving the development capacity of developing countries, including the rescheduling of the debt service payment. And to a certain extent, the same actions were also done by the G20 and the OECD. Several international non-governmental organizations like WEF, CEPI, and other specific organizations have also provided avenues for cooperation on vaccines research, on therapeutic medicines, and developing diagnostics systems. While, of course, these collaborations are not perfect and still can be improved, we are quite confident that with the presence of these collaborations and the outcomes of these organizations and the enthusiasms of the government's participations, we have been able to see the multilateral organizations play its role. The second point is, of course, while this takes place at the global and multilateral organization, the regional and bilateral relations have been complementing to these multilateral works. In our region, in Indonesia, we see the ASEAN and the ASEAN Plus partners, where the collaborations are much more intensive than the global level, which is critical to complement the global collaboration. And bilateral relations in our region, I would say it is where it completes the last mile of many otherwise would be impossible undertakings internationally. While some people would feel that this is caused by the limitation of the multilateral system and its effectiveness, we would consider that as a new reality, that multilateral systems need to be balanced and complemented with regional and bilateral relations. Multilateral systems do not produce the silver bullets to global problems and crises from A to Z. Obviously, national politics complicate the matters. Some are very worried that the nationalistic view or populism would be at the expense of multilateral system. I feel some of that quite acceptable, actually. For example, Indonesia and all equipment and some active pharmaceutical ingredients due to the trade restriction and lockdown measures taken by many countries. So we have now able to produce these products domestically. And I think it's important for countries to a certain extent get around the risk of this potential lockdown during a global crisis situation. It's important for the national interest and the health security of the countries. Of course, the question is that then could this sentiment spill over to any other industries beyond health? Yes, of course. And it's very likely this would spill over beyond the health sector. But I think it's reasonable because to rely on the global value chain, where again, the international trade prospect is very dire, with the possibility of the drop of trade of 30% globally, then countries need to improve its reliance on diversified sources. The third fact is, of course, what you mentioned earlier, the factor of geopolitical and geoeconomics condition. We saw at the beginning, it was a trade war, now moved toward a competition between the US, China, and probably involving other countries toward digital technology and telecommunications. And now practically involve many of high sensitive technology sector, and also now getting into investment and corporate equity acquisition restrictions and many others. And I think this will continue in the foreseeable future. So this is my more pragmatic view on how to look at the role of multilateralism without too high expectation, but at the same time how countries and national interests can complement that. Thank you.
So I'll speak in French because it's simpler, I think, so that everybody understands or hears me. So these two interventions, I would sum up by saying that there's a conflict with China that is perceived as a threat for multilateral cooperation, and so the rising of regionalization approaches, which is more perceived as a solution for emerging countries rather than integrating in the existing system. So it will be an additional complement. The question is it enough? And the third is a certain acceptance, a form of acceptance of a return to the nation, relocalization, notably with production. I don't like the example of masks because I think the topic of masks is due to a world demand that exploded with a view to a world production that wasn't available. So, well, whether we produce it in-house or not, I think everybody would have faced the same difficulty. So now on the question, we'll see this with Jacques on the value chains, but on the issue of China and the US, I'd like to turn to Jason Foreman, who, to have his point of view on what could happen in a world, Michael Froman, I'm sorry, where the US recover democracy or become Democrats again. So what does it change in this relation? So maybe we can move to Michael Froman. I'm sorry, Jason Furman. Yes, Michael Froman, we can hear you. We can hear you, Mr. Froman. Perfect.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. And I know we would all prefer to be together in beautiful Aix-en-Provence if we could. My take on this is perhaps we're focusing on the wrong issue by focusing so much on multilateralism and the institutions. And we have to remember that multilateralism is a means, not an end in itself. It's a means towards effective international cooperation. We have to ask why that's not working. And it's not working, in my view, because there's a lack of consensus about what that international cooperation should be about, and a lack of political will behind that. And we see that reflected in the rise of populism and nationalism, protectionism, nativism across the world. As Arvind said in his very interesting intervention, these are issues that predate Trump and are issues that are likely to exist after the Trump administration, whenever that is. And they're not issues that are limited to the United States as well. We see concerns around sovereignty, take back control, whether it's in parts of the European Union, obviously the UK, parts of Latin America, Asia, and elsewhere. I think the concern is when folks look at the international system is that it tends to emphasize the lowest common denominator, if any agreement at all can be reached. And deadlock is often more prevalent than agreement. And that has led, and I think properly led, to the exploration of other mechanisms of international cooperation, whether it's bilateral agreements, plurilateral agreements, regional agreements, all in a pragmatic effort to advance the cause of international cooperation and rule setting and collaboration, while the multilateral system itself may be somewhat paralyzed. Looking ahead, I think the real challenge is to engage substantively on why this is the case. What are the underlying problems with international cooperation? And I think we have to, some of these are very uncomfortable to grapple with, but there are issues around free riders, around burden sharing, around reciprocity. And many of these come together, as Arvind noted, around the question of how do we integrate an economy as big and as important as China, that is organized around fundamentally different set of rules and practices, into the global rules-based economic system. People, I think there's more of a consensus now within the U.S., between the U.S. and Europe, and perhaps many major emerging economies, including India, about the nature of that challenge. But there still remains quite a bit of disagreement over what are the tactics to address it. Engagement can work, but if it only works so far, what happens when engagement falls short? Are countries willing to use other tools at their disposal? And the final thing I would say is all of this is, again, in the service of what we might call inclusive growth. If we're going to rebuild the consensus, rebuild the political will necessary to have effective international cooperation, then the system needs to be built on the principles and effectively deliver growth that benefits all countries and all sectors within those countries. And what we've seen over the last 70 years has been tremendous progress at the macroeconomic level, a billion people coming out of abject poverty, the emergence of emerging economies. But at the same time, we've seen widening income inequality, a imbalance of benefits going to capital versus labor, and many problems domestically that have not been addressed. And I say that in the United States, where I think our domestic policy has failed to deal with many of the issues of workers surviving in a rapidly changing economy, but it's true of other countries as well, where our domestic policy response has not been adequate to the task. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Very interesting to see that, in fact, we're talking about the nature of the challenges, the nature of the difficulties when it comes to define the means to respond to those, take up these challenges. So we'll talk to go back to Jason if it works. I propose there's Jacques ASCHENBROICH, which has the point of view of an executive officer, but also a specialist of international organizations. Maybe we can share with him his thoughts. Okay, first of all, I think there's a fantasy where the supply chain wouldn't have resisted to the COVID-19. What we can see in a supply chain like the automobile industry is that it remarkably resisted to the COVID. It resisted when China stopped. We came to a stop, and China supplies the whole world with spare parts, and it resisted when the rest of the world came to a stop and restarted again. So, in fact, these logistic chains, which are extremely complex, resist quite well and survived to the COVID-19, but also in the past they resisted what happened in Fukushima, for example, with the nuclear incident, and in Thailand when you had all the floods that shook up the Thai economy. And so I think that we have to pay a tribute here to these logistic chains, which enable to lower the costs drastically, and these lower costs that were benefited to all consumers. So I wanted to stress this. I think logistic chains have resisted, and to go back on what Laurence was saying earlier, I think we shouldn't look at subjects like masks, for example. Masks at the world level, of course, were subject to an explosion of a demand because of COVID-19. And in the end, most of the countries, maybe sooner or later, were capable of producing masks. Us, Valeo, which is an enterprise that has nothing to do with mask production, managed to produce them for our own needs, but also to supply the needs of or the demand in the territories where we are. Where we operate. So what I will remember what was said is that to be a multinational is much complicated. For a French company, France represents 2% of the European automobile market. Europe represents maybe 20% of the automobile industry, and for a company like ours, which has its roots in France, which has its roots in Europe, we have to be present on all the markets, in particular on the Chinese market, which is the leading world market. And we have to be able to be a global, to install our technologies in all the regions, but also local. As an enterprise, we have the responsibility to take care of the territories in which we operate, not only the French territories, but also European territories, but also all the territories where we work. And so we are a strong growth company in India. We are developing in Indonesia also. And we consider that in both these countries, we have the same kind of responsibilities as those we have in our country of origin, France. Regarding the international institutions, I must admit that I was shaken up by the way the WHO treated the topic and handled the subject. It was very late in recognizing that the COVID-19 was a pandemic, very late. It was also late in recognizing that the gestures and masks were essential ways of avoiding the propagation of the virus. And when we look at it in our own enterprises, of course, we had people that were affected, but we managed to limit the infection simply because we implemented in our enterprises, in our plants, in our factories, in our laboratories, health protocols that was very rigid, that involved wearing masks, taking of temperature and social distancing, and the individual involvement of all our collaborators so that they take charge of their own share of responsibility with a view to this pandemic. So I was very surprised at the speed at which countries in Europe, for example, North America, India, or Brazil or Indonesia, countries where the culture of mask wearing does not exist, our collaborators were very rapidly capable to grasp this discipline, to accept this discipline. For an international institution such as WHO, I'm not surprised it was up to par, this task. And it's a real problem because it means that an institution can survive only if it's efficient and if it's recognized as such. I think it was said by one of the speakers to be recognized by those who have their mandates, who give them their mandates. And if there's responsibility and efficiency and the advice is not given, then it gives rise to a problem for this institution. It's the first time I deal with the WHO, and I must say I was very deceived on how they handled the problem or did not handle the problem. Thank you, Jacques. Maybe a quick question. We talk a lot about arbitrations, resilience, efficiency for the chain of productions. And in fact, what you said in the first part is that this arbitration is not more necessary today than it was before, because in the end, both work in your point of view. Well, it's what I noted, in fact, and I think we have to pay a tribute to all the actors of this production chain who, with successive shocks, I talked about Fukushima, the floods in Thailand, now the COVID-19, proved to be very resilient. So I'm not convinced that we should regulate. I think it works, but the question we should ask ourselves, and I have to go back on a certain number of figures. Before the crisis, not the case today, because we're subject to the crisis, we suffer from the crisis today, but before the crisis, in our factories, we produce 8 million spare parts per day, and we have 2 billion components that enter our factories every day. So it's an extraordinarily complex logistic chain that we took years to put in place. And we are a local producer, meaning that we produce relatively close to our clients, but the whole of the supply chain is global, because that's true for the electronic components. Very important investments, and there are few factories that in the world that can supply us. So this logistic change, which is again very complex, cannot be moved around. We can't, even if we wanted to evolve, there'll be two consequences. It would take time and would cost money. But today, our countries don't give value to our risk. They're not ready to pay more, so that we relocalize our logistics chain. So they don't see the risk, they don't perceive the risk, and they don't consider that reducing the risk as a value. And from the moment our clients and consumers are not ready to bear the cost, why move? So if the final consumers or our clients, the automobile manufacturers, don't give a value to this risk, well, there's no chance that this logistic chain be relocalized. Thank you. I don't know if we can have Jason again. If you want to go back on the polarization. Oh, we have a lot of echo. So, Mr. FURMAN, yes, we can hear you.
Yes, you hear me?
Yes. Oui.
Okay, great.
Oui.
Well, it's great to be with you online. Sorry for all of the difficulties. I think in thinking about the United States right now, there really is two paths the United States could take, depending on what happens in November. I think it's important to understand what's the same on those two paths and what's different on those two paths. The thing that's the same on both of those paths is the United States is a little bit more suspicious of the rest of the world, but especially suspicious of China. Views about China economically and the role it's played in the world, views about China politically, human rights, etc., are really shared across the aisle. You hear it from Vice President Biden. You hear it from President Donald Trump. What is very different in the two approaches is the role that the rest of the world plays in addressing and solving these problems. And, with President Trump, there is hostility to multilateralism just on principle. Whether the multilateralism helps or hurts, he just doesn't really like it. Vice President Biden, much more interest in engaging with the world and working cooperatively. And this difference can be debated with China itself. The United States has had a much tougher policy towards China in the last 3 years and has very little to show for it. We reached an agreement of managed trade with China, where China would buy a certain amount of imports, U.S. exports would import a certain amount each year. And China year to date, according to my Peterson Institute colleague, Chad Bown, is running at, I think, less than half of what it committed to. And so I think what you'll see is, both parties wanting to be tough on China. We experimented with toughness in a unilateral way, and it failed terribly. And so the alternative is to work together. Now, working together means re-engaging with the World Trade Organization. It means appointing appellate judges so the World Trade Organization can do its work. It means when it comes to the economic relationship with China, focusing not on how many American products China will buy, because the United States can't join together with Europe to push China to buy Boeing airplanes and American soybeans. But we can join together with Europe to push China to abide by intellectual property rules and fair treatment of investment. So a reorientation towards multilateral instruments and towards goals that are more universal and principled rather than managed trade and the United States out for itself. Now, what that would mean is the United States doesn't engage in trade wars simultaneously with Germany, India, Canada, Mexico, but focus, that it re-engage with international institutions and that it puts some skin in the game as well. More broadly than just the trade issue, and I started with the trade issue because in some ways that's the most complicated. Other things are very easy. The World Health Organization, on one path the United States is not a part of it, on the other path the United States is. That's a very, very simple, easy thing for a Democratic president to do, to rejoin the World Health Organization. The Paris Agreement, on one path the United States completes its withdrawal. On the other path, the United States re-engages. So, I think some issues like climate change are in some ways easier. There's all sorts of complexities, there's all sorts of difficulties, but it's one there's a lot of desire to deal with internally in the United States, and an understanding that works well externally. The last one I wanted to leave us with, since we've talked so much and had such great discussions about India and Indonesia and emerging markets more generally, is I think there's a real question mark if the crisis that we're in now turns a bit worse, what the role the United States will play is. The United States played a key role financially in the Asian crisis in the 1990s, in the Mexican crisis in the early 1990s, and the Latin American debt crisis in the 1980s. When it came to the Eurozone crisis, the United States, and Mike FROMAN in particular, were very much present, very active, not financially in the same way because they didn't need to be. Where would we be now if the IMF runs through the $1 trillion of resources it has and gets something like the $2.5 trillion of requests that earlier they were projecting? I don't think we're on track to $2.5 trillion of requests. But in that circumstance, what would happen? Would we be able to turn outward, fund the IMF, work through them, fund bilaterally, or would we say, our economy is suffering, we're suffering so much, we don't have space to think about and worry about the rest of the world? That, to me, is a more open question, a very important question. I know where I stand on it. I'm not positive where the country would. But on everything else, WHO, Paris, WTO, I think it's relatively easy, and I think there are two paths that we could go down.
Merci, merci beaucoup pour la dernière note d'optimisme.
Thank you very much for your last note of optimism, in a way, at the end. I believe that Jason focused both on the objects, the governance, the geopolitical aspects, and the economic aspects. And in order to leave some place for discussion, I'm not going to comment right now, but I'm going to ask Yaroslav LISSOVOLIK to present in 5 minutes what he feels from the viewpoint of Russia, and more specifically from Eastern Europe. How do you view this issue of international governance?
For the opportunity to participate in this discussion. I think the consensus that is crystallizing in our discussion is that there's clearly a lack of international cooperation, lack of multilateralism, and I think this is due to a considerable degree to the deficiencies, to the gaps in global governance, in particular to the lack of incorporation of additional reserves for multilateralism. And that, I think, concerns the regional domain, the domain of regional integration arrangements and regional development institutions. I think the paradox that we find ourselves in today is that there's, despite the significant role of regionalism in In the global economy and in the course of the past several decades, we've seen an increase in that role. There's still no platform for horizontal coordination among regional integration arrangements such as Mercosur, ASEAN, or the EU. Furthermore, there's a lack of vertical coordination between these regional organizations and global multilateral organizations such as the WTO, the IMF, or the World Bank. So accordingly, how could a global platform for regional institutions look like? My proposal would be to look at the G20 as the venue or the platform for such an arrangement whereby it is composed of the regional integration arrangements where G20 countries are members. So if we're talking about Germany or France, this is the EU. If we're talking about Russia, this is the Eurasian Economic Union. If we're talking about Brazil, this is Mercosur, etc. So this platform for coordination amongst regional integration arrangements would allow for additional communication lines and provide additional scope for trade liberalization. The question now boils down to leadership and launching such novel initiatives, and I think this leadership could be performed by the European Union. After all, this is the most developed regional integration arrangement. This is also an arrangement that has the largest regional financing arrangement. It has the largest regional development bank. So it is very much in a position to lead this initiative. And I think this could be done within the framework of the Alliance for Multilateralism that has been recently launched by the EU. So I think if such an arrangement is created, it will allow for additional communication lines, it will provide an additional impulse for trade liberalization, and will strengthen the multilateral forces in the global economy. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Right.
Well, I think, as Yaroslav and others mentioned, I think if you have perhaps open regionalism or open plurilateralism, meaning you don't wait for the multilateral system to act, because what we have learned is that it tends to either reach no agreement or very much a lowest common denominator agreement, but you allow coalitions of the willing, so to speak, to move international cooperation forward in a framework that is open to whoever wants to participate, provided they can live up to the same standards. And that, I think, is a way of, it's a building block approach towards greater multilateralism, so that over time you get more and more countries who want to be part of a system that is defined by high standard rules and high standard levels of cooperation. And that can then give greater impetus to broader and broader collaboration, potentially at the multilateral level as well. The issue that raises is the one I cited at the end of my comments, which was really about free riders and MFN, most favored nation treatment, which is a core principle of the WTO, but which diminishes the incentives for going to additional obligations and standards. And I think it's just one of the issues that needs to be talked about and addressed openly as we think about how to strengthen international cooperation going forward.
Merci.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry it was a bit chopped up, but another question by many people, many auditors, is to know to what extent we need a budget allowance as an integral part of international institutions. That is not something like the IMF, like a temporary safety net, but rather a permanent convergence tool. It's hard in Europe, so I think it's very ambitious at the world level. But maybe I can ask someone to answer this. Does anyone want to take this question? I think Jason is moving his hand. Do you think that a stronger budgetary support is important?
Sorry, I'm not hearing a translation of the question, so I don't know if it's a very short version. You can
Yes, je répète. Donc, est-ce qu'il faut une capacité?
Now, do we need a greater budgetary allocation that would be allocated outside crisis period? Is it a way to relaunch international cooperation? Is it a way forward?
Yeah, I think that the quota realignment that we did for the IMF was a good model, where countries were contributing to the IMF, more proportionately to their role in the global economy. It meant China was contributing more resources to the IMF, and that China was getting a larger vote in the IMF. You don't want, all of that budgetary-wise is still very small compared to the types of resources you would talk about, in something like the euro area, where you might want to think about a common fiscal policy, something that would make deal with the fact and the inadequacies that monetary policy has. And when you go outside of that, you're just talking about much smaller costs. You're talking about administrative costs and a certain proportionality to the role that you play in the global economy, I think makes sense. And, the fact is, we may not like to say it, but if you want countries like the United States and Europe that can afford to pay more, they will have more of an input into the decision in a way that they do at places like the IMF and the World Bank. And there's a difference between the lender countries and those institutions that are putting money up and the borrower countries. And so I think we have to be honest about some of that. And everyone gets veto power at the World Trade Organization is the reason that the World Trade Organization has not made the types of progress these other institutions have made. It's the reason why the General Assembly is much less influential and much less important than the Security Council is in the United Nations. And so I think we want to be balanced but also honest about these things.
Could I add a couple of words, if I may? Yes, I wanted to very briefly add.
Est-ce que vous m'entendez, Monsieur SIREGAR?
Yes, that in order to reduce the budget burden, perhaps there's also a need to use to a greater degree those resources that have already been allocated, including the resources of the regional development institutions such as the regional development banks and the regional financing arrangements. If you look at the coordinated fiscal stimulus of the G20, whether it was in 2008 or most recently this year, there's not enough of that use of the resources of regional organizations. appropriations, which actually are very significant. And if you take all of the resources of the regional financing arrangements, those are greater than those of the IMF. The same goes with regard to the regional development banks versus the World Bank. So I think we need to have a construct that allows for the use and the incorporation of these already available resources that could be used in this coordinated fiscal stimulus.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I don't know if Mr. SIREGAR hears me. Did you wish to add something just earlier, sir? Mr. SIREGAR, yes.
Yes, actually I was trying to add the question to the first answer to the first question to FROMAN's answer on the multilateral organization versus regional organization. I just would like to add that for us here in the region, we would like to complete and sign the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership 15 countries this year because we are realistic. Again, this is a pragmatic approach that geopolitical and with that the regional implication among the 15 countries next year would be such in a way that makes the signing of an agreement would be less possible. So that is the reality of the world today. Put aside national election in particular countries. We few here from the region next year would be more challenging. So we hope we can finalize and sign the historical RCEP this year, have the momentum. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Et je crois que c'est le moment pour...
Thank you very much. I believe the time has come for me to conclude, and this is a good thing because the last question was to how to summarize the suggestions and solutions. I'm not going to be able to summarize everything, but it seems to be a consensus about the object of growth, the goal of growth, which should be inclusive. For the objects, the idea is more to agree on principles such as investments or intellectual property rather than trying to focus on objects of the trade or goods per se. And amongst the objects, the things, we can talk about climate and health, but it's easier to agree when the stakeholders have a common interest and an interest to discuss the topics. And for the climate issue, it doesn't seem to be the case. Third point, what kind of multilateralism can we have? How can we have multilateral organizations and institutions? And there seems to be a consensus to talk about regionalization and more practical agreements and find solutions either in Asia or the Americas, and that it is very difficult to find a consensus amongst a great number of countries. Otherwise, you run the risk of ending up with the smallest common denominator, except for some elements. It's also important to have huge agreements. And as Jason FURMAN was saying, let's not fall into the trap of consensus. Let's try and modulate the participation in view of the economic weight. And the last thing is that for all this, you need political will. Thank you very much, and I wish you a nice day.